Okay, welcome to my N10006 study material for the Network Plus. This is dealing with Chapter 12, Network Security. This is always a fun chapter. I'm a security person, so security is always a very huge topic of discussion with me. So, in this chapter, we're looking at things like security fundamentals, what is security, defending against attacks, firewalls, VPNs, IDSs and IPSs, or intrusion detection, and intrusion prevention systems. So, first thing we have to realize is what are some of the goals for network security? What are some of the types of attacks that are out there that we'll have to know how to defend against? What are some of the best practices for implementing and defending against certain security threats? Understanding the different types of threats is a huge thing. Also look at the characteristics of various remote access security technologies. I want to talk about things like how firewalls help protect organizations, what a VPN is, and mainly the differences between IPSs and IDSs, and we'll go from there. So the network security primary goals is 3 items. CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is one method of providing is through encryption, essentially making sure that data is kept secret. Dealing with encryption, there's 2 major types, symmetric and asymmetric encryption. Symmetric encryption implies that the same key is used by both the sender and receiver of a packet, so the same key unlocks and locks it. Very common types of symmetric encryption is DES, triple DES, and AES. But don't we use AES for WPA2? Yes. Not saying that symmetric keys is bad, it's just when we think symmetric keys, we have one key that we both lock and unlock with. And here's an example. We have a shared key, and we encrypt and decrypt data with that same key. Next, we have an asymmetric key, or different key. This is a more popular implementation, which is RSA. Normally, this RSA algorithm is commonly used within a PKI, or public key infrastructure. You'll see this very common in server deployments, or even on web domains. Web domains can easily be using asymmetric keys. The big thing here is the PKI system is used to encrypt data between a client and maybe a shopping website, for example, or an e-commerce site. So we will request a certificate from the server. The server will respond with a certificate, normally signed by a certificate authority. We already have certain certificate authorities that we trust, and if it is issued by an appropriate certificate authority that we trust, and it's the correct date and time on them, we will be able to use their public key to transfer data to and from them. Next is integrity. Integrity ensures that the data has not been modified while it was in transit. It might also verify the source originating the traffic, but maybe not. The big thing here is the data has not been modified in transit. Examples of integrity violations may be defacing a corporate web page, altering an e-commerce transaction, modifying electronic stored financial records, manipulating a data packet while it's in transit. I mean, an email, you interject new information or you remove information. All of that is appropriate. Not really appropriate, but all of that would be classified as integrity. One way of providing integrity is through a hashing process. So the sender will run a string of data through an algorithm. The result is a hash. The data and the hash are sent to the recipient. The recipient runs the data through the same algorithm, and they look at the two hashes. If they're both equal, then the data wasn't modified. The recipient compares the two hashes. The big thing here is it will check. If the hashes are the same, it's the same data. So the most common hashing algorithms are a message digest 5 or MD5, and that will create a 128-bit hash, or a secure hash algorithm, or SHA-1, that will create a 160-bit hash. Other ones could be a challenge response authentication mechanism, message diecast, or a CRAM MD5. This is a more common variants of the HMAC often used in our email systems. Verification that, again, no data was manipulated or modified during transits. Availability. This basically just measures data accessibility. The point of security is to keep resources available while keeping those that have access to them, well, with access. And those that don't have access to them, or legitimate users, they're not. So, examples of how network accessibility can be compromised could be crashing a router, crashing a switch, some type of denial of service or distributed denial of service, or pegging whatever resource that you're trying to gain access to and having lots of people try to access it, so there's no availability for it. In terms of overloading like a file server or an FTP server. So categories of network attacks. If we're looking at a confidentiality attack that attempts to make confidential data viewable. Integrity, again, tries to alter the data. Availability tries to limit access to or the usability of those resources. Confidentiality attacks could be things like packet capturing, Wireshark, ping sweeps, and port scans. That's, I mean, again, these are very subjective, but I mean, from the networking side, this is viewed more as a confidentiality attack. Normally, ping sweeps and port scans aren't really, but in this broad definition, they are. Dumpster diving, trying to collect data out of a dumpster. Wireless interception, wiretapping, wireless tapping, maybe even social engineering to get private data out. Here is an example of a confidentiality attack. We can actually maybe interject information between companies. That way we can route traffic a specific way. Integrity attacks could be more like a man-in-the-middle attack, a salami attack, a data diddling attack, trust relationship exploitation, passwords, botnets, or even session hijacking. I mean, like, botnetting, not so much data integrity. Botnet I could also see being a confidentiality or even an availability, because the purpose of a botnet could also be a DDoS attack. Man in the middle may be passive, meaning it's not there to interject or manipulate, but just collect. So here's an example. The attacker could have you route information to him, and then once you give the appropriate credentials, maybe he manipulates the account. Basically, this allows the hacker to divert information to and from the potential victim. Not saying it's very easy, not saying, this is always feasible, but I mean, this is just one example. An availability attack, distributed denial of service or DDoS attack, a sync flood attack, a buffer overflow, ICMP or ping of death, electrical disturbances, or maybe even physical environment attacks. You know where their equipment is, you make it run hotter, or you make it run cooler. So here's an example of a DDoS attack. Normally it's made to work with a few requests. Instead of a few requests, we start pegging it with hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of requests. That's always feasible. A sync flood attack with HTTPS or with TCP, there will actually be a three-way handshake, and the sync is the first part of that. And so we could actually start opening a bunch of handshakes and then never actually terminating them or going through them. Next, we have a Smurf attack. A Smurf attack is just a distributed denial of service attack, which again, normally will have an attacker, and we could then direct a botnet to target a specific resource. That's always feasible. Electro disturbances, power issues, surges, faults, blackouts, brownouts, power sags, things of that nature. Normally, to help prevent this, we have a backup generator or a UPS or a uninterruptible power supply. That way, if we have a power spike, we could have a surge suppression system. That way, the spike doesn't do damage. In our physical environment, we are looking at things for temperature, humidity, gas, smoke. But those are just a few of the types of attacks. If we're looking at other types of attacks, we could be talking about best practices to help defend, user training. That's always a big one. Implementing policies and enforcing those policies. Remote access security, access control lists, honeypots, vulnerability scanning. That way you can actively see where the vulnerabilities are so you can help guard against them. Keeping software up to date and patched. Those are all big items. So user training. Things like what to do if you get a weird email asking for your password. What about password security? That way users know what they can and shouldn't be doing. That could also deal with how to train people to detect social engineering. Patching, again, making sure software is up to date with current patches. That way, known vulnerabilities can be patched and secured. Security policies, or the lack of security policies, such as like an acceptable use policy or an asset policy. You have to be able to tell end users what they can and cannot do, and what's acceptable. And then you must also then enforce them. Components of a security policy could be a governing policy. We'll have technical. We may have end user policies. We also may have standards, guidelines, and procedures for certain policies. This kind of depends on the policy and how it's developed and implemented. Next, incident response. Basically, what to do after a violation has occurred. Looking at maybe its motives, maybe its means, its opportunity. Basically, how do we respond to a specific incident? How do we better protect ourselves? Vulnerability assessment. This is a big one. Vulnerability scanning. Part of vulnerability assessment or vulnerability scanning. That way you can see where the vulnerabilities are so that you can better protect against them. Very common ones are Nessus and Nmap. The Nmap does a lot more than just vulnerability scanning. Nessus will actually give you the framework for a vulnerability scan. It's more complex, but it's a nice little tool. Nmap, also known as Zenmap, depending on the interface that you're using and the operating system that you're using, could do things like reconnaissance for your network. So you could see what addresses are open, what addresses are responding to what ports, things of that nature. Honeypots and honeynets. A honeypot's a single machine. A honeynet is multiple PCs. Normally, we're looking at if an attacker comes in, we want to steer them away from our actual network by giving them something more enticing to go after. A honeypot. Access control lists. Those are lists that we can filter off of, normally made up of several access control entries. We can filter based off of like source and destination addresses, source and destination MAC addresses, and source and destination port addresses. That way we could say only allow access to this IP address, only allow access to these ports. That would be an access control list. Here's an example. Permit the layer 4 protocol TCP with any source IP address going to a specific range of addresses, and we're going to allow both www or port 80 web traffic and telnet, meaning all other ports will be denied. Once we create the access control list, we put it on a router and we say how we want to filter this. Are we going to filter this coming into the router or leaving the router? Remote access security could be things like how do we gain access to our machines remotely? It could be things like enabling single sign-on, enabling two-factor authentication. If we're trying to really push security, maybe we could be doing 802.1x for our authentication for our wireless and wired clients, and attaching that to a LDAP server like Active Directory, using something like Radius. If we're doing remote access to devices, maybe instead of using Telnet, we're using SSH. So those are some of the feasible options. Okay, moving on to firewalls. So, interesting thing is a firewall and router can also do things called network address translation or port address translation. That's the mechanism that changes a private IP address and masks it to a public IP address. That's NAT and PAT. So that's not really a firewall, that's more a routing technology. Going into firewalls though, we have two types of categories: packet filtering and stateful firewall. So stateful firewalls will inspect traffic as part of a session, recognizing whether the traffic originated from inside or outside the LAN, whereas packet filtering permits or denies traffic based on packet header. That's going to be part of the source, destination, as well as port numbers. Packet filtering looks at each packet individually. So essentially it allows for filtering. We can do it in ACL so that there is no incoming response. So even though we can request it going from the inside out, the outside coming back in may get denied. Where the stateful firewall, because it was initiated inside, should be allowed to continue, while a new session just coming from the outside may not work. It basically boils back down to who's initializing it or who is trying to start it. If it's coming from the inside, it's acceptable. If it's coming from the outside, it's not. We can also have firewall zones, like inside and outside, as well as a DMZ. Normally the inside is the inside of our network, the outside is the internet. And we could have this DMZ, which is going to be kind of like both. What I mean by that is anything that's going to be allowed access outside, like a web server, an email server, we could put in a DMZ. And that way, no outside traffic normally deals directly with the inside traffic. Normally, it will just go to the DMZ. VPNs. So, we have multiple types of VPNs. A VPN just allows an extension of your LAN through another network. Normally, this is done securely. We have two major types. We have a site-to-site and a mobile-to-site or client-to-site. A site-to-site allows you to hook up multiple locations into one, and they'll act as one. Whereas the client-to-site will be more like you're going through the internet, might be a laptop, and you're traveling, and you keep connecting back to a centralized site, but never back from the same location. You're mobile. You're going to a conference or you're traveling. That's going to be a client to site or a mobile to site. Again, a site to site, these are going to be more offices that do not move, where a client to site could be a mobile worker who changes depending on where they're at. So how does how does this VPN functionality work? Common one is through IPsec. That's our current security model, and it provides protection in CIA. There are weaker forms of VPNs out there, but again, normally IPsec is the one that you want to do. Within a VPN, we have different types of modes and phases. So one of the primary protocols used by IPsec is the IKE Internet Key Exchange, and the IKE is used to encrypt messages in the authenticated peers. So IKE will have 3 modes: its main mode, its aggressive mode, and a quick mode, as well as 2 phases. Essentially, you set up your tunnel from point A to point B. How often do you want to check if that tunnel is going to be up? If we're dealing with an aggressive mode, it's going to check very aggressively, check very regularly. To establishing that connection, we have 2 phases. Phase 1 will establish the encryption and authentication protocol between endpoints to create the IKE Phase 1 tunnel. Once the Phase 1 tunnel occurs, and it establishes the encryption and authentication protocols between the endpoints, it will use the Phase 2 to create the IPsec tunnel. So transport mode versus tunneling mode. You can actually encrypt more of this material. You actually have, again, your ESP authentication and your trailer, your payload, and your header. Then you have the original IP header. In tunnel mode, same general idea, except you have both the original and you have a new header. So again, the steps is you create the Phase 1 tunnel, you verify the encryption and authentication for the Phase 2 tunnel. Once you can go both ways, it creates the IPsec tunnel. Actually, one more thing when we're talking about VPN tunnels, we can have a header encryption or a packet encryption. So we can actually encrypt just the header information, or we can encrypt the entire thing depending on your needs. So that said, let's go ahead and move into our intrusion detection and intrusion prevention, IDSs and IPSs. So when an attacker launches an attack against a network, normally IDSs and IPSs should be able to recognize and respond. IDSs are not active, meaning they just watch. They're passive. Normally, these devices will look at the incoming data streams and analyze the attack using different methodologies. They may look for signatures or for policy-based detection or just for abnormal traffic. So these devices could know what's normal and what's not normal. And anything not normal, it may set off an alarm. So IDSs versus IPSs. Both devices recognize attacks, but again, IDSs are passive. They monitor, where IPSs are active. They send alerts. They do things. They're active. So IDSs and IPSs placement on the network. Normally, IDSs will probably be deployed more towards our end users, where IPSs will be more towards the firewall. We have host-based and network-based, depending on what we need. Snort is a very common host-based and network-based IDS. So you're going to notice we're going to start adding an N or an H. So if it's an N IPS, that's a network IPS. If it's an H IPS, that will be a host IPS. Depending on its location, it may or may not be able to stop certain types of attacks. For example, a DDoS attack is going to be tied to the network. So a network IPS may be able to drop the DDoS attack, whereas the host IPS would not be able to. So some deployment examples, we may have a network IPS close to the firewall, and we may then have some host IPSs on machines. That's actually it for this chapter. We covered a lot of security information, confidentiality, integrity, availability, the different types of attacks, as well as firewalls, VPNs, IPSs, and IDSs. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.